Yes, this is another segment of European history, AP European history with Dr. Brovkin, and today's topic is expulsion of the Jews and Muslims from Spain. So this took place beginning from 1492 and then 1502. So the story, of course, is called in Spanish Reconquista. And that is the reconquest of Spain. And this is a long, long historical process that lasted truly for centuries. And it only ended with this kind of very dramatic and tragic events that we're going to hear today. Basically, the Moorish presence in Spain is 700 years approximately. So the conquest took place in 710. And then it lasted in 1492. It was a slow process, and I said even today in Madrid there is a mural Arab. If you go to in the neighborhood around the Royal Palace, you see mural Arab. And of course the very word Madrid means Maghreb, if you didn't know that. So the whole history of Spain, in every Spanish city there's Alcatraz, which is a former palace of the Moors, or the fortress. You also know, since we are from Marrakesh, that Kutubia in Marrakesh is its twin, identical tower in Seville, which looks perfectly identical, and also Alcatraz, and also very beautiful Moorish monument. So this was a long process. Seville fell in about 1300s, Cordoba even earlier, with its magnificent mosque, probably one of the most beautiful mosques in the world. So now we're to Granada, and that's the last bastion, the last kingdom of the Moors remaining in the beautiful Andalusia. So at that time, so we're talking about 1470s, 1480s, it stretched from Malaga to Granada, so the southern coast of Andalusia, and it had a population of 4 million people. So that's a pretty sizable population. Of those, later we would know that 3 million were Muslim. So I make the conclusion that of those 4 million, 3 were Muslim, and there was 1 million Christians and Jews. The Jews are very specifically 300,000. So there must have been about 700,000 Christians living in Granada. Now, the contemporary descriptions, of course, and you could see today, Granada is probably one of the most beautiful places in Europe. Probably one of it could count into one of the most beautiful in the world, specifically the Alhambra Palace, which is probably one of the best examples of Moorish architecture or Arab architecture or Islamic architecture, which is all the same thing. It's absolutely magnificent. I spent hours and hours and hours walking around in Alhambra. Usually the busloads of tourists would come out and they looked and they take a picture and they ran off. What I did was I would sit down, take the book by Mr. Irving, The Tales of Alhambra, and I would sit down in the corner somewhere. Let's get back. So Alhambra is absolutely magnificent. Its fountains, its palace, its ornate arabesque roofs and gardens and fountains. It's probably just absolutely magnificent piece of architecture. But the city itself was, by the contemporary standards, probably one of the most beautiful in Europe, because it had things that European cities did not. Even Florence didn't have what Granada had, which is public parks, public works, libraries, university, schools, hospitals. I mean, it was one of the probably most civilized and most advanced cities in Europe, but it was pretty much like any other city of that time of the Islamic civilization. They all had libraries and public works and hospitals and universities and fountains at palaces, etc. So Cairo and Baghdad and Jerusalem, they all had it. So from that point of view, the only thing that distinguished was the gorgeous palace of Alhambra. So the Spanish were coming, and it was clear. It was advancement, on the map. You could see like every 20, 30, 40 years there will be another advance. And another was a slow encroachment on the remaining Granada, the last kingdom. So the final act was, in a sense, was caused by a dispute between the royalty in Granada. There was Sultan Abu al-Hassan, and the story goes, is one of the stories of the tales of Alhambra, that he fell in love with his slave girl, and his wife Aisha was so jealous that she engineered an overthrow, a coup d'etat, and his uncle took power, and then there was a fight between the two, and then Boabdil is the last sultan. He fought against his opponent in his of the clans, and also had to face the Spanish. And the Spanish entered Malaga in 1481 and made a pretty big mess out of it. So it was a taste of things to come. There was a slaughter, and there was a lot of people, civilians, who were killed. Finally, the last battle was in 1482, and Boabdil lost, and then his famous words, that he was standing on the hill looking at Alhambra and crying, and his mother told him, "You shouldn't cry as a woman about something that you couldn't defend as a man." And so he left, and the Spanish entered Granada. At first, they had a pretty easy terms, which kind of reminds the Arab terms when they would conquer a Christian city. So even more generous. The locals could keep their property. They didn't have to pay any taxes for the first 3 years. Anybody could keep their religion, and only would start the non-Christians would start paying taxes after 3 years, which is in reverse of what the situation was under the Moors, which means that the Christians and the Jews paid and the Muslims didn't. And those who wanted to leave had a free passage. All of that changed in 1483, when Inquisition was formed. So Inquisition was pretty much a commission of inquiry into the heresy. So officially, at first, it had nothing to do with the Muslims and Jews. It had to do with those Christians who were heretics. So at first, nobody thought it was a big deal, so they're going to inquire about something. But then, little by little, they began to spread their activities into those who said that they converted, and then in fact didn't. So there were a lot of Jews who pretended they converted. Some of them said no, they refused to convert, but there were some that did convert, and that's where Inquisition steps in. So they were any sign of anything that could sort of relate to Judaism would be, of course, an act of heresy, and you would be a subject of Inquisition. Anything like having a meal on Friday night, or saying something about Jerusalem. A lot of Jews constantly say next year in Jerusalem. Any kind of, you don't eat pork, that's suspicious. So the point is that this is the most important thing about Inquisition. They used informers, and people would come and denounce. This reminds me so much of the Soviet Union and the KGB, when the system depends on informers coming and telling us such and such is doing such and such. So this is what the Inquisition used highly, very often. And then another important point is that one had to prove its innocence. It's not the other around. Not you're innocent until proven guilty. You had to prove that you are not a heretic. How is it possible to prove that you believe in Jesus Christ? How? How can you prove to the Inquisition? It's impossible. You could say, yes, I believe, but nobody can verify it if it's a matter of disease. So they can say, you did such and such, and he said that you did such and such. You had to prove that you didn't do it, which is a lot of times impossible. So anyway, the Pope Sixtus in 1483, as the expression goes, almost banned Inquisition. And the reason it's interesting is what he said. He said, the Pope, this is one of the Renaissance Pope, he said, the Inquisition shows more lust. These are his words, not some historian. These are the words of the Pope. The Inquisition shows more lust for gold than zealous for religion. Many innocents were condemned for their money. That's the Pope speaking. And so he thought that these abuses go so far that he wanted to ban it, but of course he didn't, and it just kept going. Probably he didn't because the Spanish would have disobeyed him anyway, and he decided, perhaps, this is my guess, I don't know, but he didn't ban it. So upper classes basically opposed the Inquisition, and the lower classes loved the spectacle of somebody being burnt at the stake. So here's official data. Up to 1488, 8,800 people were burnt at the stake in Spain, mostly in Andalusia, mostly for being a heretic, which means those probably converted Jews or Muslims. And 94,000 were punished in some way, just in 8 years from the time of supposedly peaceful acquisition of Andalusia. But all of that is just the beginning. All of that is just the beginning. At first, the expulsion concerned the Jews, and this is the Edict of Expulsion, which is 1492. So that's 10 years after the conquest of Andalusia. The Edict of Expulsion. Here's what it said. Ferdinand and Isabella, signed by both of these rulers of Spain. All Jews must leave Spain, never to return, under the penalty of death. As I said, 230,000 Jews. Of those, 100,000 left, and 50,000 converted, and 80,000 is unaccounted for. Either they died, or they dispersed, or nobody knows what happened to them. One of the most dramatic moments was when some of the rabbis led the Jews to Cadiz, which is in the south, and Gibraltar, and they were staying there at these cliffs, and the rabbis were giving this sermon that the waters now would separate, like they did with Moses, like in the Red Sea, and there will be a passage for them to escape to Morocco, to escape to freedom. But of course they didn't separate, and nothing happened, and they waited and waited and waited, and nothing happened. And then they had to hire ships, and there was a storm, and many of the ships were brought back to Spain, and they were captured, and they were punished, and they were sold into slavery. It was very, very dramatic moments of this escape. Many Jews went to Portugal. And there were such a huge number that King John was terrified that they would overwhelm Portugal. And he did at first something that was quite nice. He offered them ships at reduced cost to enable them to go to different places. But after 8 months, he basically lost patience. And he sold into slavery the Jews that remained in Portugal. And then he did something quite cruel. He ordered to seize children, minor children, from Jewish parents, and then to raise them as Christians. And there were absolutely dramatic moments when some Jewish parents would kill their parents, kill their children, and then kill themselves, rather than allow them to be torn away from them and raised as Christians. So this was his successor. That's 1496. That's Manuel, King of Portugal, ordered that all children under 15 will be forcibly baptized. And finally, after these tumultuous times for the Jews, comes the turn of the Muslims. The edict is 1502, and it orders all the Muslims to leave Spain or be converted. Now, if we're talking about a much bigger number, there were 3 million Spanish Moriscos, as they were called, Muslims. 3 million. Now that's 10 times more than 300,000 Jews, and they were all ordered to leave. And if they didn't, it's either you leave or you die. So that's the option. And of course, a lot of them did leave, and the only ways they could go, they couldn't go to France or Italy as the Jews did, or Portugal. The only way to go would be to Morocco, and many of them died on the way. Many of them were seized by the slave traders and sold into slavery. Many of them pretended that they converted, and a generation later there was a famous uprising of the Moriscos, which was bloodily suppressed. Anyway, the whole story is an outrageous example of what today would be called ethnic cleansing, or religious persecution on a mass scale. It would be called crimes against humanity. And it is the Spanish kings and the Portuguese kings, and most importantly the Catholic Church, which I usually call a criminal organization that never apologized for the crimes against humanity that it has committed against the Jews and the Muslims. Thank you.